In my opinion, aside from winning a UFC championship, the greatest accomplishment in mixed martial arts is to achieve longevity in the sport. To be able to have a long career and compete at the highest level in a young man's game is an admirable feat. But to go about it the way Michael Chandler has done it is truly something very special. The reason for this is because Chandler, now one of the biggest names in the most talent-rich divisions in the game, didn't arrive to the UFC until he was 34 years old, which is a pretty rare occurrence when it comes to the UFC, especially when it comes to the lighter weight fighters. More often than not, we see the elite talents in the UFC go through their ups and their downs, and in the latter stages of their career, exit the UFC and move on to other promotions, likely making better money, but receiving far less notoriety and recognition. We've seen a lot of big names in this sport go down this path, and it's not to say that there's anything wrong with it. It's just that in a lot of cases, the ending of these fighters' careers just kind of happens, and they go out in an anticlimactic way with not nearly as much attention as they deserve. Michael Chandler is in the very rare percentage that went about it the other way. If he retired after his Bellator run, he would have had a remarkable career that saw him make a lot of money, make a name for himself in the sport, have a 21-5 professional record, and become a 3-time world champion. But instead, after all of those years of being the face of a major organization in the sport, he arrived to the UFC with an immense amount of experience, already being considered one of the best lightweights in the world, and has a whole new, very long chapter left to go. With this, I feel like he's setting a really good example to other fighters out there in terms of career trajectory. The vast majority of up-and-coming MMA fighters will tell you their dream is to make it to the show. In this day and age, between the Contender Series, the Ultimate Fighter, stepping up on short notice, there seems to be more and more ways for younger, inexperienced fighters to land in the UFC. But time and time again, we see very hot prospects get in early, have some success, but ultimately fizzle out and get cut before getting the proper experience that'll aid them in reaching their full potential. Whereas Chandler was seemingly a Bellator lifer with no intentions of coming to the UFC. He had an incredible 10-year career that saw him create the instant classics with Eddie Alvarez, which was a big part of how he made a name for himself, and a ton of incredible performances and vicious knockouts over the likes of Patricky Pitbull and former UFC lightweight champion Benson Henderson, and become a 3-time champion in the process. Most fighters his age that reach the point in their career where they've had multiple world title wins, amassed a 21-5 record, and dealing with years of wear and tear, are in the stage of the career where they're winding down. And Chandler's out here winding up. He entered the promotion with an absolute bang. Chandler's first fight in the UFC against Dan Hooker perfectly embodied him and his entire career. If you want to know who Michael Chandler is and what he does, go back and watch that fight. It's the exact type of performance that he's been bringing to the table his entire career. After all of those years and an incredible run with Bellator that anybody could have proudly went out on, he has a lot of runway left with the real possibility of reaching the pinnacle of the sport, which is the UFC Championship. He has shown no signs of slowing down or diminished durability, and he seems every bit as motivated as anybody else on the roster, especially now that he's coming off of one of the nastiest knockouts in the UFC last year. 18 of his 23 wins are finishes, and half of those finishes are first-round knockouts. 9 first-round knockouts on his record. When the ref gets out of the way, Chandler gets in his opponent's face and tries to end the fight immediately. Every single time. Always coming forward, always going for the kill, always producing thrilling affairs. He arrived to the show with high expectations and a lot of questions from critics out there, and he has gone on to meet all of those expectations, with 4 fights in the UFC that produced utter chaos. And now he's set to meet Dustin Poirier at UFC 281 in Madison Square Garden, which, as I feel like I can safely say by now, there's no chance that fight's going to disappoint. With a guy like Chandler with his level of motivation, there's no way him aggressively trying to get Poirier out of there immediately isn't going to produce fireworks under the brightest of lights. Should he go out and score an emphatic finish against the former champion like he does more often than not, that definitely lands him in the title picture. These days there are just so many fights, so many fighters, and so many stories, we don't stop long enough to process one event or a particular fight because we're already looking forward to the next. So I just wanted to take a moment before we get into the fight week of UFC 281 and all the craziness it's sure to bring us, to give some appreciation to Michael Chandler, for the example he's setting for other fighters in terms of what's possible, for what he's done, and for what he will do.